All right, let's jump right into this explainer. We're going to unpack a truly fascinating geopolitical journey today. Think about it. How did the world's oldest democracy and the world's largest democracy go from being basically historical strangers to forging this booming, yet, let's be honest, highly complicated strategic partnership? Let's find out. To make sense of all this complexity, we're going to follow a simple roadmap. We'll start with their rocky historical start, move on to the massive 1991 turning point, explore the contemporary trade boom, look at current trade frictions, and finally discuss the way forward. Okay, so let's kick things off with Section 1, a rocky historical start. If we look back at World War II, there was this incredibly stark contrast in leadership ideology. Before the war, the US barely even noticed India. But suddenly, as the conflict exploded, India became this absolutely vital logistics hub. Now, on one side, you've got US President Roosevelt. He viewed British colonial policy as morally repugnant, and he aggressively pressured his allies to give India independence. But right up against that, you have Winston Churchill's fierce colonial defense. Churchill outright rejected Roosevelt's advice. He stubbornly predicted communal violence and claimed Indians were simply incapable of self-rule. So what's the big takeaway here? Well, while Roosevelt provided ideological support, the U.S. ultimately had to bite their tongue and tolerate Churchill's colonial stubbornness just to maintain their broader strategic war aims against the Axis powers. And you know, that early philosophical difference completely bled into decades of Cold War disconnect. In 1942, India's Quit India movement totally frustrated U.S. war logistics, which created some really early tension. Then, by 1947, right after Indian independence, we see deep friction over the U.S. taking a neutral or arguably pro-British stance on the Kashmir dispute. Fast forward to 1971, and we hit rock bottom. The U.S. actually deploys the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise to the Bay of Bengal during the India-Pakistan War, which was a massive signal of military support for Pakistan. And then, in 1974, India completely shocks the world. They conduct their first nuclear test, actively calling out U.S.-led non-proliferation treaties as a form of nuclear apartheid. Throughout this whole era, India is leaning heavily into non-alignment and cozying up to the Soviet Union, while the U.S. is actively backing Pakistan through military alliances. But, as we know, history never really stays frozen. That brings us to Section 2, the 1991 turning point. The sudden collapse of the Soviet Union was literally an earthquake for New Delhi. For decades, India had leaned on Soviet diplomatic cover and military hardware. So when that protection vanished overnight, it forced Indian policymakers to desperately scramble for a new strategic anchor. They quickly realized they needed closer ties with the United States, not just to fill that massive Soviet vacuum, but to effectively balance against a rapidly rising China right next door. Simultaneously, a massive domestic storm was brewing. First, the Gulf War hits. Buying expensive oil rapidly drains India's foreign exchange reserves. And if that wasn't bad enough, those same hostilities in the Middle East forced the sudden repatriation of over 100,000 Indian workers. That completely slashed their vital remittance money. To top it all off, a whole series of massive loan payments to multilateral banks suddenly came due. This triple threat effectively broke the back of India's old socialist-style economy. They literally had no choice but to open up to the world. And wow, did opening up change absolutely everything. These unique domestic and leadership factors finally bridged the gap between the two democracies. First up, Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao radically opens the Indian economy, basically rolling out the welcome mat for global trade. Then, the Indian IT sector explodes, and this perfectly coincides with a massive US.com era, literally marrying the two economies together through tech and skilled labor. Politically, the ice starts to thaw when US President Bill Clinton remains neutral during the Kargil conflict. Crucially, he refused to aid Pakistan at India's expense. And finally, the Bush administration completely rewrites the rulebook by signing the landmark Civil Nuclear Agreement. Together, these moves totally transformed India from a chronic economic underperformer into an absolutely invaluable strategic partner for Washington. All right, let's shift gears to Section 3, the contemporary trade boom. Because, guys, the economic growth we're talking about here is explosive. Look back at 1999. Total bilateral trade in goods and services was sitting at a meager $16 billion. In the grand scheme of global economics, that's practically a rounding error. But over the next 2 decades, the economic dynamic completely transformed, surging by more than 10% per year in recent times. By 2019, bilateral trade topped an astonishing $146 billion. Seriously, take a second to let that number sink in. This was a monumental milestone. It meant the United States officially became India's absolute largest trading partner, definitively knocking China out of the top spot for the second consecutive year. But here's the catch. Despite that massive $146 billion headline, smaller economies are actually punching way above their weight class. Take South Korea. They have a GDP roughly 40% smaller than India's, yet they do nearly 1.5 times more trade with the US. Even wilder, Vietnam. Their economy is 10 times smaller than India's, yet their trade with the US sits at 84% of India's total volume. For global consumers and everyday investors, this just screams massive untapped potential. I mean, a fully realized US-India trade relationship, it could fundamentally reshape global pricing, supply chain stability, and consumer access worldwide. So, what exactly is holding all that untapped potential back? Let's unpack it in Section 4, Current Trade Frictions. It's your classic geopolitical push and pull. The U.S. is demanding access for its excess agricultural ethanol, they're heavily lobbying for lower tariffs on American medical devices, and pushing super hard for much stronger patent and intellectual property protections inside India. Conversely, India's demands are entirely different. They want market access for agricultural products like wild-caught shrimp. They want the reinstatement of duty-free trade programs, and they're pushing for a social security totalization agreement, so their citizens working in the U.S. can actually repatriate their hard-earned social security savings. A glaring sticking point in all of this is the GSP program. The Generalized System of Preferences is a U.S. trade program designed to allow duty-free entry for certain goods. Fun fact, in 2018, India was actually the largest beneficiary of this entire program. But then the U.S. decided to yank India's duty-free benefits over trade disagreements. Naturally, this immediately sparked a tit-for-tat trade war at the WTO, which led directly to India slapping retaliatory tariffs on American items like steel, aluminum, and apples. We're also seeing deep friction in the modern tech and services sector. Washington has some serious digital grievances. They are incredibly frustrated over India's strict data localization rules, their e-commerce restrictions, and a data equalization levy that is directly hitting American software giants. Think Apple, Microsoft, and Amazon. On the flip side, New Delhi has intense visa demands. They strongly object to U.S. laws that apply significantly higher fees on H-1B and L-1 visas. And remember, these are the exact visas that India's highly skilled IT workers rely on to provide services in the U.S. And these disputes get incredibly granular, directly impacting everyday consumers. India capped foreign direct investment in certain sectors, which definitely frustrated American investors. The Indian government also slapped aggressive price controls on U.S. medical imports, like coronary stents and knee implants. Meanwhile, the COVID-19 pandemic severely stalled U.S. FDA inspections of Indian pharmaceutical facilities, causing massive global supply chain headaches for pharmacies everywhere. And just to complicate things a little more, the U.S. is now actively pressing to include strict child labor and environmental standards in trade talks. India, however, firmly insists those shouldn't be mixed into trade framework agreements. So how do these two giants navigate this absolute maze? Let's look at Section 5, the way forward. The crucial takeaway here is that resolving these tensions is going to require a highly focused, multi-pronged approach. First, reinstating the GSP is absolutely vital. It would heavily benefit Indian exports and strongly position India as a viable alternative to Chinese goods in the U.S. market, which, by the way, could lower prices for American consumers. Second, negotiators absolutely have to focus on delinking unrelated issues. Threatening to cap visas because of a data localization dispute, it totally goes against the spirit of building trade. Third, the two nations need to institutionalize their economic dialogue, getting the USTR and India's Commerce Ministry to the same table regularly. And finally, they must heavily boost private sector collaboration in the technologies of tomorrow: cyberspace, AI, 5G, 6G, and semiconductors. So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. Can the world's oldest and largest democracies finally overcome their granular trade frictions to effectively counter global supply chain monopolies? As global supply chains rapidly shift away from single-source dependence, the ultimate success of this democratic partnership is going to depend entirely on their ability to step back, look at the bigger picture, and finally move past decades of friction. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep analyzing the data, and I'll catch you on the next one.